start the recording, and then we're going to hit start the webinar. We'll give it a few moments to give folks time to log in. While everybody gets ready. Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they're going to be chatting with Bradford Pearson about his new book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, a true story of football, incarceration, and resistance in World War II America. So you are in for an excellent time tonight. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to our host, Patrick and David, and tonight's featured author, Bradford, for making this happen, and to all of you guys for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Couple housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There's a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like 2 speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day, and you can purchase Bradford's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, your series hosts for Squawkin Sports are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. He also has the virtue of being my neighbor. We're zooming in from opposite ends of the same apartment building, so it's fun to hang out this way. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. The two of them are going to be speaking with our featured author, Bradford Pearson. He's the former features editor of Southwest, the magazine. He's written for the New York Times, Esquire, Time, and Salon, among many other publications. He grew up in Hyde Park, New York, and now lives in Philadelphia, from where he is joining us tonight. His new book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, is an impeccably researched, deeply moving, never before told tale about an extraordinary World War II era football team, the high school team from an incarceration camp for Japanese Americans at the base of Heart Mountain in Wyoming. The Eagles of Heart Mountain honors the resilience of extraordinary heroes and the power of sports in a sweeping and inspirational portrait of one of the darkest moments in American history. So Bradford is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Pete, Patrick, and David, and with all of you. So please take it away, Patrick, David, and Bradford.
Jess.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you want to go through the reading first.
Cool. So this reading is from a chapter about a game that the Heart Mountain Eagles, which is a high school football team at a Japanese American incarceration camp in Wyoming. It's against a team. I picked this reading because they beat people from Montana, which is Patrick's state. So that was why I chose this reading in particular. The 1,100-person student body filled the sidelines once again. If the Worland game was expected to be a blowout in favor of the visitors, the fans, coaches, and players had no idea what to expect from the team from Red Lodge. The county's location on the state line meant the Coyotes split their games, half Montana teams, half Wyoming teams. No one at Heart Mountain knew anything about the Smith Mine disaster or the fact that most of the Coyotes were off in the South Pacific aboard a Navy ship. All they knew was that the team had lost to Cody the previous week, which didn't stop the Sentinel sports editors from confidently announcing, quote, with Babe Nomura leading the attack from his tailback position, the Heart Mountain 11 is favored to take the Red Lodge Prepsters by a 3-touchdown margin. The teams lined up under a 78-degree sky, and the Carbon County kicker sent the ball deep. Kichi took the ball at the 10-yard line and ran diagonally across the field, heading to the left sideline. Babe faked as a blocker, then sprinted towards Kichi. The pitch was flawless. Babe cradled the ball, looked downfield, and saw nothing but open dirt. Arms pumping as the dust kicked up beneath him, he was gone. Gone from that field, gone from camp, gone from Wyoming. Remove the barracks and the barbed wire and the military police. Add some bleachers and sketch in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel looming over the field. Replace the stones with grass, color in the green of the palm trees and the white of the wobbly Hollywood sign watching from Mount Lee. Replace all the bad with all the good, and for those seconds, he can be just a boy doing what he loves most. Babe strode into the end zone, untouched. Out of either pity or kindness, Tubby and Thompson pulled the first team. In went Tazo and Stan and the others. Second and third stringers determined to fight their way into the starting lineup. Their baptism was beset by penalties, holding, clipping, offsides, spending too much time in the huddle. The first two were the result of carelessness, but the latter two were more understandable. 11 teens who'd never played the sport before on a stage in front of 4,000 of their peers and neighbors. The anxiety and indecisiveness could be forgiven. Despite their nerves, in the second quarter, backup quarterback Billy Shundo marched the Eagles down the field. The drive ended on a 20-yard strike to a wide-open Masu Cheetah in the end zone. The first stringers returned for the second half and kicked off to the Coyotes. It didn't take long for the ball to be back in Babe's hands. Standing on the Coyote 47, he called a play for himself. Horse cleared the way at left tackle. Babe cut up the middle and went untouched again through the back of the end zone. Up 19-0, Tubby decided to try another one of his new plays on the Eagles' next offensive possession. At 5 feet, 11 inches, Horse was the tallest player on the Eagles. On a team mainly of teenage boys between 5'5" and 5'8", this should have meant he'd play either a quarterback or another position where his height could have been used in passing or catching situations. But Horse lacked one thing, any real ability with his hands. He couldn't throw or even catch. He couldn't shoot a basketball particularly well, nor hurl a baseball. The only thing he could do well with his hands was throw a punch. On the football field, he could block, and that was about it. Still, Tubby saw a chance to use Horse's size. On their next offensive possession, Yoichi snapped the ball to Babe, who faked a run up the middle. Babe wheeled around, pitching the ball to Horse, who'd peeled off from left tackle and was breaking downfield with a head of steam. As the Coyotes collapsed on him, he lateraled to Mas Ogamachi, drifting wide right. The 20-yard gain was nullified by penalty, but the message was clear. We're going to play our style of football. In the waning minutes of the third quarter, the Coyotes punted from deep in their own territory. Kiichi ran it back 38 yards for the fourth and final touchdown. The Eagle starters took the field for only 6 plays the entire afternoon. They walked off with a 25-0 win. After the game, Babe was interviewed by the high school newspaper. When asked about his prowess, not only on the football field, but the basketball court and the baseball diamond, he would only say that he, quote, knew a little bit about ping pong.
So good.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
This
The
team,
thing that
this is my
people
favorite team ever.
the people who haven't read the book might want to know is that before you get to the really fun high school football part, there's like an extremely good pocket history of American prejudice against Japanese people. Like basically the first third of the book, like could be taught in classrooms. And then you read a little bit more and then you get like cool football action.
Yeah, well, that was kind of like, that was the plan. Not necessarily, if you look at my book proposal, it's not the plan, but as soon as I started writing it, and as soon as I started researching, especially, I was like, I don't think I can really tell this story and just make it a football story. Like I wanted to use the characters to sort of tell the history of Japanese American incarceration before the war, but then also sort of right leading up to what they were experiencing before they even got to camp. And like you said, sort of the decades that led up to Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor was just sort of the final event in these decades of discrimination that allowed, sort of gave the federal government the go ahead to finally do what thousands and thousands of white supremacists and farmers and ranchers and politicians have wanted to do for years on the West Coast, which is just get rid of everybody with Japanese blood.
And can we do one thing before we get into it? And I'll probably fuck this up later, but internment camp, not the correct term. Please explain why. And concentration camp seems to be the one, but I guess the question is that equates it with Auschwitz, etc. But why is internment camp not right? And what is the term that you landed on?
Yeah, so when I first started doing research for the book, I would always just say in Japanese internment. And sort of I go over it a little bit at the beginning of the book, in that even that expression has 2 errors, and that it was mostly not Japanese, it was mostly Americans, mostly Americans of Japanese descent that go to these camps. And the term internment technically has a really it has a very technical definition about enemy aliens and the term internment camp only really came into popularity after the war in the 50s when everyone was trying to figure out what to call this era of incarceration. And like you said, the term concentration camp became synonymous with extermination camps. And nobody in the Japanese American community is equating these camps with extermination camps. But to make that difference between like what Japanese internment means to them, the term Japanese American incarceration has come into popularity. So that's why I decided to use it, because, I'm not Japanese American. So I deferred to folks in that community for the terminology that they use and are comfortable using today.
There's one bit that I don't want to make you talk about your book proposal, because I know that it's a traumatic experience for anyone who's even thought about writing one. I've never even come close to doing it, but I don't even like the thought. How did this start? Because this is, the book has a very broad sweep. And I know that there's you could see the nugget of what like a certain type of pitch would be. But then this, as with, I think with Eric Nussbaum's book, which I think is one of the very best ones that we've read for this series and that that I've read in a long time, it becomes this, really big, sprawling political, social history.
Right.
Like, where did you start with it, and how did you get from where you started to what you wound up with?
Oh, and throw in, because I was going to ask this, throw in the FDR tie you have.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
In the acknowledgement, I thought that was fascinating. And my brother was CIA, so I've done some high.
Oh, all right. Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say that Eric's book, I'm very glad I read after I wrote my book, because I would have read it and just climbed into a hole and tried to figure out how to write a book as good as Eric's.
They're weirdly quite similar, I think. Which is, I know that you couldn't possibly have been reading each other's stuff, but it's the only thing that's reminded me of his book that I've read, before or since.
You also have, you both have wonderful 5 o'clock shadows.
Yeah.
I watched Eric's Squawkin Sports, and I was like, okay, well, I need to just do that.
Yeah. Get tall.
I can't promise that sort of height. He also did his standing up, which I was like, that seemed unfair. Because he was so tall. But anyway, this is real inside.
No, but yeah, this is like for the real heads that have been like for every episode of the series. Anyway, so how did you?
Okay. They're like, yes.
So to answer both of the questions, I grew up in Hyde Park, New York, which is FDR's hometown. So my entire life had sort of been steeped in this idealization of FDR. Like, I went to FDR high school. Our high school mascot was the president's. So my whole life I'd had this image of FDR, and you learn that in New York, your knowledge of Japanese American incarceration is like, even in AP US history, it's minimal. Like, you spend maybe a half a day of lesson on it, and you're expected to maybe write like one of those short essays on the AP history test about it. But so years ago, 2013, I was on a press trip. I was doing a story about Yellowstone. So I was in Wyoming, and one of the people who was leading the trip was like, hey, she was on the board at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center and was like, hey, why don't we go check out this museum one day? And I was like, okay, sure. And I went in sort of expecting to know exactly what I was going to see. You go and you're like, oh, I know this. And I left just completely embarrassed by how little I knew about this history. But there was one really small, there were 2 lines about the Heart Mountain Eagles football team on this one display in the museum. And, like, all of us have written for a long time. And like, when you see something that you want to write about, it just kind of like sits in your head. And for me, it sat there for years until I was just like, okay, I need to actually do this. And I didn't really know what it was going to be. So getting down to the book proposal, it's like, at the time when I first started researching, I was like, I don't know if this is going to be a story. I don't know if it's going to be, podcasts weren't really a thing then, but it seemed like something that could have had that sort of story arc, or it could have been a dead end. But then when I really started researching not only the team, but the history of incarceration and Japanese American history, I realized, okay, I can't tell this story of this football team in a 4,500 word ESPN feature or whatever it was going to be, So that was when I had a book agent already, but I didn't really have any good ideas. And then I told him this one. He's like, no. Like, you need to do this one now. And so that was when I really started getting the idea of kind of expanding it to be a bigger picture. And those history chapters are a lot longer than I ever intended them to be. And I mean, just between us and the viewers, probably still a little too long, even though I cut like a ton out of them.
I didn't find, it's my type of thing. Like that was like, I'm interested in learning about stuff like that. And I was a history major in college, but never really a very good historian. So for a lot of this stuff, it was like hitting some pleasure centers because I was like, oh, that was the anti-immigration bill that they did. And then there's actually 4 of them. I just conflated all of them into one
thing.
Omnibus racist statement that was signed by
President
Wilson, maybe, or someone else. But the one thing that I think so I think the book is really good, but that I think you can kind of feel in it that you get in some of the best sorts of stories of this type is that you can see where it started, and then you can feel why, for instance, it begins with 100 pages of history with only trace elements of sort of football or Wyoming in them, which is that like you can feel that you pitched one story and then wound up finding and the hooking into something much bigger.
Yeah,
and that's
also,
exciting to read.
There's also the thing, there's a recent podcast called Death in the West, which I really recommend. Zach Dundas and Chad Dundas and some other people. And it's about the murder of Frank Little, who was a union leader in Butte, Montana, back when the mining wars were going on. The only reason I mention it, though, is they dig into some other things. And one of the things that Montana history classes I took were pretty good. We weren't super steeped in this. I knew of it. I visited as a kid. But basically, when you peel away the onion of the Old West, no matter what state you go to, there's always a bunch of massacres.
Yeah. I was going to say, you're basically working your way back to some sort of mass grave affiliated with a mine of some kind, usually.
Yeah. Right in here, you got the one. There's 25 people. Somebody gets their wiener cut off and shoved in their mouth. It's like, oh, right. This is we also did this to these people, because there's always an Old West massacre.
I think I cut a massacre out of the book. Because at one point I was like, all right, I can't have 3 massacres / industrial disasters. I feel like 2 was people were like, okay, guy, I get the point. Oh, I guess I kind of included the third. I kind of included the third because of Custer. So maybe it was 4.
I like the idea that there's some board in your home where you're keeping a ratio of exciting punt returns for touchdowns against industrial disasters / mass death events.
Yeah, it's and where do those overlap
right.
that I can exploit?
I think that the one part, and we'll do a little bit more on the way back history. I was sort of fascinated that at one point it was we need to be more racist against the Chinese. So let's let the Japanese in for a little while. They filled this void for a little while. I was like, the Chinese are ruining everything. We need to go after them. So you're fine for now.
Yeah. And
your time in the barrel will come, but for now you're okay because there's not very many of you.
Right. And that's the same thing that happened, especially you mentioned that in Hawaii, it was just waves of people from the same part of the world, right? It was Chinese people. And then they're like, oh, we got to get rid of you. And then it was Japanese. They're like, oh, we got to get rid of you. And they're like, oh, maybe Koreans and Filipinos though. And then they're like, oh no, we were wrong again.
So in terms of when you were, obviously you started working on this, you said 2013, I guess is the germ of when this thing started.
Yeah.
When were you writing this? And so I'm assuming in the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So I got the book deal in the spring, February of 2018.
Wow. Because this is, it's obviously there to see in the text, but I wasn't the one reading the primary source material. The way that immigration, not just the cruelty of it and the sort of the unreconstructed bigotry, as opposed to the more euphemized but equally gross version that's animated our politics over the last few years, that the way that the sort of the policy failures and the capitulations rhyme with the way that we've seen these sorts of failures over those last few years. I was struck by the I think it's Leland Ford, the congressman, who's like friends with Japanese people, not like a bigoted guy. And then like after a few months or whatever, is like, actually, you know what? Like this actually plays for me. So I'm going to do it.
Oh, the same shit over and over. It's just the same goddamn thing.
So that's what I was going to ask about for Brad is like, how did you feel doing that? Like, I mean, I guess like, I'm not going to be like, was it hard or like, where do you get your ideas? Or like, I don't want to like ask a Chris Farley question, but at the same time, there's something about it. Like if it was hard to read for me, just in terms of what it evoked, like, what were you feeling going through that part of it?
Yeah. I mean, you sort of hit the nail on the head in that it's like, for me, it was, so I really started working on the book in earnest right after Trump was elected. And every time I would tell people about what I was working on and the story and all of that, people would be like, oh, that's so relevant right now. And like every year, what they compared the relevance to would change. So it'd be like, at first it was like the Muslim ban, like the immigration ban from Muslim countries. They're like, oh, that's just like what you're writing about now. And then it became child separation. And family separation. And they're like, oh, that's kind of like what you're writing about right now. And now it, is sort of that, like you said, like that racist opportunism. That's kind of just like this naked political opportunity where they're just like, oh, okay, we can whip this up and I can excitedly sort of get reelected because of this. And then the most recent thing when I've started, promoting the book is all this disinformation that comes in like right after Pearl Harbor, when, like you said, like everything right after Pearl Harbor, there's a lot of communities that are really supportive of the Japanese American neighbors. There's politicians that are really supportive. And in LA, even in Los Angeles. And then over the course of just a couple of weeks, because of people like Walter Lippmann and the Hearst papers and a couple different radio hosts, that it completely flips. And a lot of it is based on this disinformation where they were saying that there were radio transmitters that were found in Japantown and Little Tokyo.
They're
and
signaling submarines.
There's guys with mirrors in the hillside, and and none of it was true. But it's sort of this. It's the same kind of stuff that we've been going through since November 6th, where it's like, and then through January and through today, where you're just like, all of the entire removal was obviously like the culmination of decades of racism and bigotry. But then the real, they lit that fire just a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor because of all of this disinformation that was flooding every newspaper and even the LA Times. Like you look at the Times right after the war, right after Pearl Harbor, they were like super chill, like we got to respect our neighbors. And then in the matter of weeks, like the mayor and the Times were both just, really.
But I think that leads to one of the most amazing things about this, and not to be offensive, but the Nazis had a plan and they followed it and they executed it very well. This was not some sort of like final solution. It was just this haphazard, weird, like there wasn't even really a plan other than the Japanese need to go away from here. In your book, at times, the camp is generally benevolent. It's like, sorry, you gotta stay here. And then other times it's punitive for this couple of weeks. And it wasn't even that long. We say 1,187 days. It's that weird sort of American racism light. Well, maybe that's not the right word, but it's like, we're only a little bit racist, so we're not gonna force you onto trains, but we are, but you can get a couple of bags. Like the whole thing was so haphazard. And in such a short amount of time, I guess I thought it was a more planned out thing than it was. It just seemed like spur of the moment, a bunch of white racist California grape growers were like, get rid of these fucking
You should
people.
leave.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that was like, nobody knew what they were doing. They were just said, we got to get rid of Japanese and Japanese Americans. So it was like, and they used all of these military necessity, and they're using all of these sort of trumped up ideas of why they needed to be removed and ignoring their own military intelligence to do so. Roosevelt ignored it. Secretary of War ignored it. Like lots of different people ignored this for the sake of just, sort of placating the West Coast and placating the ranchers and farmers who have been pushing for this since the late 19th century. But you sort of hit the nail on the head where you're like, they had no idea. And not only did the WRA, but they were doing it so quickly. Like when Milton Eisenhower shows up to be the head of what becomes the War Relocation Authority, he was sort of a meek, mild-mannered guy. Like he wasn't like Dwight Eisenhower. Like he wasn't this huge military guy. And he comes in and is like, this place is a mess. Like, and he had this idea to do, still not great, but a more benevolent solution in terms of sort of work release and all of this. And all the Western governors are like, absolutely not. Like, and if you bring any Japanese to my state, we'll kill them. We'll hang them from trees. And then Milton Eisenhower was like, okay, well, I guess if we do build these camps, we got to actually make them prison camps. And he couldn't sit with it. And he eventually just left after only a couple months. And this other guy, Dylan Meyer, took over, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm cool with it. Don't worry. Like I'll do this." He's like, "I can sleep at night."
It's such a recurring theme in it is like how mediocre so many of the people behind all this crime, which is, I mean, historically is the only word for it, like were that it was just like apparatchiks and like paper pushers and cowards and just dunces who were kind of like going along as opposed to standing up to any of it. It's an infuriating book. Again, given that it has so much spicy football action in it as well.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah, you should ask some questions about the football action, because otherwise I'm going to keep being like, do you remember that guy that you hated, the DeWitt guy? He sucked.
I do want to say one thing personally. If you growing up out there, you have this sense of how wronged Native people were. Mm-hmm. Like I grew up an hour from the Crow Indian Reservation. Then we had a lot of Crow kids in my high school, and we played them in sports. And there's just, at least there was a sense of the progressive-ish mind. But I think even just a regular person who doesn't have some insane view of, that reservations, it hasn't worked. Right. It's a weird system where you have your own government, yet you have no real resources. And then when I was in high school, was when casinos started, and that's a whole other. But there's at least somewhat of a sense that this was all based on slaughter and this and that. There is not really, the Japanese community didn't face that. So this is like this weird few-year underpinning where it's like, we're just going to treat you 2/3 bad or 3/4 bad, or like.
And the thing is that like
strange. Just I don't remember exactly what I'm saying. It's just it's not based on this long historical terrible treatment because they weren't here very long. I mean, in your book you have a lot of examples, and there just wasn't very many Japanese to begin as I get where it starts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's kind of, the thing is that I think, and a lot of folks will agree with this, is that yes, it was a terrible years that they had to go live in camp. But the after war years were more difficult in some ways for a lot of folks in terms of the fact that because they got sent to camp, they had to sell everything in literal hours and days to get rid of. So you have people that had completely successful businesses that had to give those up and sell them for pennies on the dollar. And you had people just trolling through neighborhoods, just offering like, $1.50 for a refrigerator or, $100 for a fruit market. So I think that the economic distress that the Japanese American community went through, not only during the war, but then after the war, is something that really doesn't get enough. Everybody sort of, not everybody, because nobody talks about this, but like, there's some people who are like, there were reparations, there was redress for the Japanese American community. It's like, well, okay, but that doesn't take away from the fact that, like I say in the book, like one of my characters' families sold their strawberry farm for pennies on the dollar. And that strawberry farm now is like where Microsoft is based in the in Silicon Valley. View. Yeah, it's Mountain View. Like it's when your phone, when you open a new iPhone, it like puts it there. Like, and so, I think that you're right about some of the comparisons and some of the differences between the reservations. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt made those sort of comparisons too, where she said when she visits the Gila River camp, she's like, we got to do something about this or we're going to have the same problems that we have and the same situation that we've created with the native reservations. And she's saying that in 1943, never mind looking back with like the lens of history, like she understood that in the moment.
And she's a real minor hero in the book. She didn't have a big role, but she was one of the few who were like, we probably shouldn't do this.
Yeah. And I mean, and she told Roosevelt, she told FDR that, and FDR, that was basically the breaking point of their marriage, was when he signed 9066 without any of her knowledge or consulting. And before that, up until that point, they had a relationship that I don't think was necessarily based in romance, but it was really based on this sort of mutual, like they relied on each other for consult. And I think that this moment when he chose not to consult her on this, I think it showed that Roosevelt knew what he was doing was wrong. And I think from Eleanor's perspective, it kind of broke their marriage. And I'm not saying, like her biographer said that, that's not my original thought here.
Let me ask you one more question before we get to the football. You actually reached out to me last summer as Squawkin Sports loyalists know. I spent a lot of time in Montana last summer, and I went to the camp. Obviously, you can walk around. Everything's closed because of COVID.
It's open now. It's open.
Oh, they've reopened? Well, Wyoming wasn't. I was shocked it was closed because Wyoming was not exactly.
Well, free and easy.
Yeah. But one thing I was struck by is how many, there's a plaque to the Japanese servicemen who died, who had been in the camp, and the number of people who actually served. It's interesting. Some of them went willingly. Others seem to sort of, it's better than prison. But just talk a little bit, if you could. I promised myself I would never say that like a
Coach, talk about the third quarter.
I will never ever say that.
I do it once every time we do these.
Seemed like they were doing like a hurry up. Could you talk about like a hurry up offenses?
Yes, could you please,
if you want,
about a little bit, just the veterans and how many went to fight and how insane that is. And you have that one, the picture in the book, and you got to read this. There's a scene in around here. Somebody's on the boat and they hear about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, it's insane. Yeah.
So basically, and this is something that I knew nothing about before I started researching the book. So as soon as the camps opened, basically the War Department was trying to find ways to get people from camps into the Army. Basically, they were like, oh, no, you can't join the Army. Like right after Pearl Harbor, they basically said, no Japanese Americans can join the Army at this point. And even like a lot of Japanese Americans wanted to sign up because they were Americans. They weren't Japanese. They wanted to fight for the United States. And the Army and the War Department said, like, no, you can't do that. The Japanese Americans that were in the Army to begin with had their guns taken away and basically were on like latrine duty for years. But then pretty quickly they realized, oh, it would be really great to have tens of thousands of people to send to France and to Italy. So even after the camps opened in 42, by the spring of 43, they start trying to get volunteers out of Heart Mountain and out of all of the camps to join the Army. And they think that they're going to have this really easy, the military recruiter shows up at Heart Mountain. He thinks that there's about 12,000 people at the camp there. I think there was about 3,700 men of around 3,000 something men of military and like volunteer enlisting age. And as soon as they get there, they greatly underestimated the sort of questions that they'd be asked. So all of these kids in their teens and 20s started saying like, okay, well, what's going to happen if we volunteer? Like, are we going straight to the front lines? And they're like, oh, no. And they're like, well, do we get to be free? And they're like, oh, we don't really have an answer. They're like, are we citizens? Like, it's like a super simple question. Like, are we American citizens right now? And they're like, we also can't really, that's not really in our purview. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, you get this draft resistance movement that sort of crops up. At that point, it was just a resistance to enlistment. So you have thousands of people at Heart Mountain that are of draft age, and the military recruiter leaves with like 37, I think, people who are enlisted, and only 2 people ever get that enlist, like actually ever get sent to the European theater from that wave. And then basically a year later, the War Department's like, okay, now we're actually just going to draft you out of camp. Like, we need people. We're just going to draft everyone. And that's when at Heart Mountain, this draft resistance movement really explodes. And, they have these huge meetings on camp in the barracks. The FBI is sending spies into these meetings. The head of the camp from the WRA is really trying to destroy this movement. And then it really bears fruit. But then all of a sudden, they get the U.S. attorney to start pressing charges, and that ends up being that 63 guys get charged with draft resistance, and they get tried in the largest mass trial in Wyoming state history. And the reason that I included that in the book, not only because I ended up sort of telling this story about Heart Mountain more as a place, was that these are sort of the decisions that the kids on the football team were having to make, right? So you're a 17, 18-year-old high school senior, and now all of a sudden the War Department is trying to draft you out of a camp where your family is still going to be held in camp, despite the fact that you're in Salerno or in France. And then you have no real promises that you're going to not be sent right back to that camp if you are on leave, if you don't get killed. So, I was sort of put myself in their shoes. Like, the three of us have been 18-year-old boys, and I don't know what I would have done, so I thought that it was, that part of the story was sort of became this universal idea for me of what it's like to be a teenager and sort of be on the cusp of adulthood and have to decide not only for yourself, but for your family and for the Japanese American community writ large as to how you're going to represent yourself and your community and what decisions you're being forced to make.
I can say I would have gotten drunk on Schmidt Tall Boys.
The historical record does not lie. It's very clear where Patrick Sauer is concerned.
Nah, I'm not going.
So let's get to some football. Are you
Hell
ready?
yeah.
Are you ready? Look at
I
that.
have a
Look at that.
Cletus, the robot animation. Imagine it on your screen right now. He's wailing on a guitar.
Got
Now
some
it's
cold
football
hard
time.
facts.
Yep.
Should we do a couple? Let's do a couple of guys.
Okay.
Orson Babe, tell us about this, and I think for people to understand, these guys had never played football. Also, if anyone has any questions, we'll get to those, but we only have one now. We can keep talking.
Jump them up.
These guys have never played football really, and they go and kick ass. But let's tell us about a couple of them, and then we'll get to the reason they were good because of their innovative offenses.
Yeah. So basically, when camp opened, there was nothing for anybody to do. There was literally the WRA provided no guidance, and we're like, we're not going to give you anything to do. So pretty quickly, the folks in camp were like, okay, we're going to build a baseball field. So within a month, they scrub all this land and build a baseball field. Soon they build a football field and they start playing. Then by that winter, the high school athletic director is like, okay, I think he's like, he came from this high school that was in Eastern Wyoming and was like, okay, I think I can schedule some games here with some local high schools in basketball. And they just get run off the court. They just get annihilated. Like, they don't even have a basketball court to practice on. So they're just getting run off the field. After that first summer, the same guy is like, I think, maybe we should start a football team. He doesn't know that only 3 kids in the high school had ever played varsity football before, but he's like, all right, well, let's do this. And 3 of those guys, the first guy is a guy named Babe Nomura, who you mentioned. And Babe, I mean, he was, a lot of people have said, myself included, that he's the best Nisei athlete, which is the first generation of Japanese Americans, that he's the best Nisei athlete of all time. He, not giving too much away, but later on he gets invites to try out for the NFL and for Major League Baseball. So that's the kind of once in a generation talent that we're talking about here. He's a starting running back at Hollywood High in LA, starting shortstop on their high school baseball team, was an all-star in all of the Nisei Athletic Union, pretty much every sport in LA. This guy is either on his high school starting lineup or he's dominating the Japanese American leagues. So he shows up and he's really the anchor of the first season. So he has to kind of whip the rest of these dudes into shape. And one of them is a kid from Mountain View, this guy named Horace Yoshinaga, who had played varsity football on the Mountain View High School. And him and Babe came from 2 different universes, right? So Babe grew up in Hollywood. His parents had a boarding house right on Cahuenga Boulevard. So you could walk out of Babe's front door, look over your shoulder, and you just see the Hollywood sign. And Horst grew up on a strawberry farm. His parents moved every couple of years, just like chasing strawberries and chasing the nutrients in the ground. So those two meet at Santa Anita racetrack, which is the sort of the holding center before Heart Mountain opened. And they become friends for the rest of their lives. So these are the two main players that I follow through the book. But then, only one other player. So 40 kids show up for tryouts.
Is the other player Lomo Shinji, which is my favorite line of the book. Give him a baked ham and he'll play all day.
Also true of me. I'm just not very good at football, but I love ham.
I love playing.
Yeah.
You can just play anything all day after a good meal of baked ham.
It doesn't say what I'm playing.
And you get to play football. I mean, that's an afternoon right there.
So as you know, like Lomo doesn't come up very much in the book, and he's in the book because I saw that line and I was like,
good man.
I was like, there's
feature
no
writer brain sneak it in there.
I was like,
let the shit get wasted.
I was like, baked
Give him a baked ham. This if it's cold cuts now.
He was the biggest Eagles player, and he had also, he had played at Phineas Banning High, which is sort of in like the Long Beach Terminal Island area in LA County. But yeah, so only, they got 40 kids to show up for tryouts, and those are the only 3 who had ever played high school football before. So they started pulling kids from everything. They started pulling shortstops and track stars and decathletes and pole vaulters and basketball players. And they just kind of pooled all these kids, and over the course of 13 days, taught them enough about football to play the first game.
The style of football too is a very interesting sort of thing, because it's one thing to say that like the football is a way for them to, sort of express themselves, to seize some sort of agency. All of that stuff sort of reads like cheap promo copy. That's just naturally the level I think at. And it's all correct enough, but also they do play a wild style of football, like without getting too into, the X's and O's and the whatever, breaking down the all 22 tape. Like, talk a little bit, Coach, about the style of football that is being played by the Eagles.
Yeah. So basically they show up and are like, okay, we have to play these teams these games against these Wyoming and Montana. I mean, look at Patrick. These are well-fed lads.
You give these guys a ham, they're going to go all day.
So how are we going to play against these guys? And, it wasn't, they were just much smaller. Like I said, most of the guys between 5'5" and 5'8". The starting center was 120 pounds. So they sort of had to say, okay, what are the strengths that we have? And the strengths that we have are that we're small in a way, we're fast. They don't know who we are. They've never played against us before. And because we're small and fast, we're also not going to tire as easily. So they're playing both sides of the ball at this point too. So they're playing offense and defense. And they basically just figured out that if we just try to run all of these teams off the field, they're going to get tired. And a lot of times the Eagles won their games sort of in those final quarters, I think, when the other team is just dragging ass. And there's a combination of that. And then also they have this one coach, they have one white coach who's just sort of becomes like, he's just kind of like a minder. I think the camp was like, oh, you guys need to have a white coach. And basically this Japanese American coach comes in and is like, okay, I actually know how to coach football and play football, so I'm going to just do this. And he played at LA City College. And at that point, right before the war, when he was playing, they had started sort of experiencing and started experimenting with a no huddle offense, and sort of a spread offense had just slowly started in the early 40s at some colleges. And they played it at this LA City College that this guy named Tubby played at. Tubby, Ham, lots of, it was a more uncouth era.
Did you you don't go into like historical football stuff, but I thought that was pretty surprising. Was it a West Coast college thing? I mean, I think of all these spread off and stuff being like an invention of the 80s, like, and maybe that's just because I grew up watching the NFL where nobody did anything interesting.
I think 1997. Yeah.
I think that just a lot of this stuff sort of got lost to time, and that it was, I'm talking about a JUCO college from the late 30s. So it's not like, there's no game tape. There's nobody that's like carrying water for the LA City College Cubs as the best team of all time. So I think that, and they weren't running full offenses on this. I think they just started to experiment with it. But I would always caught my eye when I would see a score that was like, 35-7 or 40 points. I was like, okay, how are they putting these points up? Even like when I was doing my research, I would go back through old newspapers and try to find people, but then also just try to find what football was like then, because I go into it a little bit in the book where it was just like people won games 7-6.
Yeah, it was still like that
6-9.
Like sort of grunty East Coast for like the version that was played at elite schools and service
Right.
academies.
It was like, exactly like Cornell playing like the Latrobe School of Guns or whatever.
They did good work there though.
But that was also really interesting thing
for everybody.
That was the thing where it was interesting learning about these West Coast colleges too, because it was like St. Mary's had one of the best college football teams in the country in the 30s and 40s, and Willamette College, or like Mary Hardin, and like all these schools that would never, some of them still have football teams, but they were some of the best teams in the country that were recruiting some of these Eagles, or when they were in high school. So it just sort of, for me, it was a good lesson in football history in terms of thinking about what, how the sport's developed too.
Well, it didn't feel exactly like teams were ducking them, because they weren't allowed to leave. They had to play there, so you had to drive a long way. But on the other hand, it was sort of like, I don't know, were they? They didn't feel like they were ducking them because they're too good. It was one like, it's not worth our time to also have a chance to lose, because
it was. I think it was a little bit of both. I think that first season, people would sign up for games just thinking that they were going to get an easy win. Like when Warland came in, and Lovell, they were like, okay, well, it'll be an easy win and we'll go home with a win. And then this doesn't give much away, but they don't lose any games in the first season. And then that second season, I think they did have a little bit of a harder time scheduling games, because teams would pull their games off the schedule once they realized that the Eagles were good. So, and if you look at the two closest teams, the two closest towns, in Cody and Powell, neither of them ever played a regularly scheduled game against the Eagles. And I think a lot of that was because they were close enough to know that how good this team was all the time. And Cody played one scrimmage against them, got blown out 45-0, and pulled their game off the schedule and just said, like, we're not going to lose. Because if you walked down, the middle of Cody during that time, and from 42 to 45, all the signs on all the stores were saying, no Japanese allowed, and things with more racial slurs than that. So it definitely wasn't a welcoming community.
No, and I should say I'm wearing this ridiculous Wild Bunch headband because you could buy that at the Irma Hotel. You can buy it any day at the Irma Hotel. They have a nightly shootout, Dave. A lot of COVID jokes about masks last year.
Sounds terrific. Wow, that's really edgy stuff.
Less racist.
I've seen the shootout many times. Reporting trips.
I think Wild Bill Hickok was up to like 240 my last summer.
Solid. Yeah, that's what you want. You want a Wild Bill Hickok. It could also be an H-back if you need it at the highest level.
A lot of ham.
So we're back on the ham.
Like a Mike Allstott of
it's a good look.
Bill Cody.
So I have more questions, but there's questions in the Q&A. We should probably solicit more because
I want to run the clip though. So Jess. So this is from the Japanese American Museum in downtown LA. I believe it was 2013 it was filmed. Anyway, it's about a minute and a half. It's filmed with horse, and it's pretty amazing, and you get some clips of the football.
Tell me if the sound is okay. If it's not, we'll start it over, but I think we're good. Here we go.
At the Japanese American National Museum, downtown Los Angeles, we witness a reunion.
Can you turn it up?
People once held apart album, now 70 years later.
I can't. Sorry, I gotta optimize the video. Sorry, I have to redo the screen share. I apologize, guys.
It's okay.
I thought I had it all ready, and I did, but then I pushed the wrong button. Try this one more time.
All right.
Here we go.
At the Japanese American National Museum in downtown Los Angeles, we witness a reunion of sorts. People once held at Hard Mountain, now 70 years later, take a trip back in time through this photo collection.
When I look at this now, it rekindles a lot of memories for me.
This is 88-year-old George Yoshinaga. He still writes a column for the Rafu Shimpo, a Japanese American newspaper out of L.A.
Were there a lot of folks from Los Angeles in Hart Mountain?
Yeah, I would say 80%.
There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous.
George was 18 at the time and became one of the stars of the Hart Mountain High School football team. Patty's father captured photos of him on the gridiron, and his memory is remarkable.
Now that's you running.
I'm on defense in this particular play. This was against Lovell, and we beat them 7-0.
Football was his escape. Even though they were held at a concentration camp, they were allowed to play the local high schools as long as those schools came to the camp. His team went undefeated.
They probably couldn't play their best game because they would come to camp and the fans circling the field were all Japanese faces. They couldn't imagine that we know how to play football because most of the people thought that we were really Japanese, you know. They were totally amazed at, said, geez, I didn't know Japanese knew how to play football.
It was a telling lesson for the visiting teams. These were not enemy aliens. They were Americans.
George.
These photographs bring back vivid.
That was Force,
Yeah.
who really does not live up to his nickname.
He could run. He just didn't. He lacked the hands.
Oh, it was like a race horse. Not. I guess think of horse as like.
That's how he got his nickname, right? He got his nickname at Santa Anita. So, which is a part that I didn't talk about. But if you read the book, you'll learn that many folks were held in horse stalls.
All right, we have two questions. I'm going to do one, and I'm going to leave Dave the other one.
All
right. Roth, that would be you, made a great point early on. This is history. It's American history, Wyoming history, Montana history, Japanese history. Really good books do this. Can sports be a useful vehicle for learning this broader history? I grew up in Wyoming in the 80s and 90s. Steve. I only learned about Hard Mountain when I was 22 and in college in Montana. If I read about a high school football game like this when I was in high school, it probably would have resonated more than any textbook. Sorry, David, calling you Roth just to affect your homer. So naturally,
I appreciate it. I'm used to it.
I think that's actually a great question. I feel like growing up, when I would get a good sports history book, and they weren't that prevalent in the 70s and 80s. But do you think sports can be the way conduit? Actually, Jess is always like, I didn't know sports books were this. And as a conduit to learning about the broader social issues, it seems like a great way to get.
I think from my perspective, it's the reason that I wrote the book the way I did was to try to get like a different audience to learn this history. Because if somebody like me who was an international relations major in college, studied history forever, knows so little about this, the average American, not to put myself on this pedestal, but this is the stuff that I'm interested in and have studied. If the average American doesn't stand a chance based on like the way that our education system teaches this. So using sports, I think sports gets used in a lot of ways that it shouldn't be used from like a patriotism standpoint or whatever. But I think using these sort of stories, Eric's book, Eric Nussbaum's Stealing Home is a great example of that where, and I guess this book, I tried to do it too, but like, sports are a part of our lives, but they're also a way to sort of tell this history of how they became a part of our lives. So it's, for me, it was like I was able to use these characters as a way to tell a longer narrative than just these football seasons. And that I did that on purpose and sort of looked at it like, all right, like this is probably a little blunt, but like, if I can convince people to pick up a book that they think is just about football and it ends up being about racism and xenophobia and immigration and American concentration camps, and even if they get to the end of it and they're like, I thought this was going to be about football, that sucked. Like they still learned what like they still read the whole thing to get to the end to be like, oh, I didn't care for that. So
The football stuff in this book is really good though. I was actually what I figured, because Eric's book is great. I don't keep going back to Eric's book.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a lot of on-field action.
that's true.
I was like literally like when you did the thing where, oh, did he catch the pass? Did he not? This fucker left a cliffhanger. Now I got to read 10 more pages.
That was surprisingly difficult from an edit standpoint to get through multiple edits in terms of different editors and different copy editors, that cliffhanger. So I won't give away what it is or when it is, but it was a little difficult, especially when your different editors and different copy editors weren't as big as sports fans, or, so I'm glad that it resonated as the reason that I did it on purpose, obviously.
Dave can grab the other Q&A questions. There's somebody in the chat. We should address this. Who would eat a baked ham faster, Brad, David, or Patrick?
That's Kevin Kazwara. He's a writer. He asks the right questions.
I'm actually I'm a fat guy. I get the BMI 30 vaccine. I qualify.
Nice.
Oh, congrats.
I'm fat, drunk, and stupid is a way to go through life.
Yeah.
But I'm a slow eater.
I feel like, as I said in the chat, I think it's going to come down to who wants it more. I know that's cliched, but I mean, that's what it is.
I'm going to give it to Brad.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I can eat pretty quick, and I actually can eat a lot. So
all right,
cool.
You win the baked ham off.
I'll take the ham. And the family I grew up in is a ham family. We're not, we don't keep a ham household here, but my lineage, my Hyde Park lineage is that we're a ham family.
Yeah. If you grew up that close to the Culinary Institute of America.
Yeah, you can't. There's so many types of ham right there.
Yeah,
it's just you guys, lifestyle is glazed.
My brothers, the night before his graduation, at the party, the sword and the champagne. Is that just like a thing in everyone Hyde Park? You're gonna have a glass of champagne. You need some.
Anyone's gonna have a Miller Genuine Draft. Same deal.
Saber.
Yeah, sophisticated. It tastes
I actually was sort of like, you're 7 years younger than me, and I'm not the most responsible guy, but I'm probably gonna leave now because there's swords. And anyway, you want to grab one of those?
Yeah, let's do some of the questions. So Karen Tanabe asks, did any of these guys go on to play college football? Personally, I'm still crossing my fingers for a Japanese player in the NFL.
Yeah. So the Babe Nomura, the main character, he does go on to later on. He plays at LA City College, and pretty quickly after the camps close, there's this wire story that goes out across the country that there's a big picture of Babe, and it just says, Los Angeles, home to best Japanese American gritter in America. And it's this long feature story about Babe and about his time in camp and about how good of a football player he is. And from there, it's in that story, his coach basically compares him to Jackie Robinson and says, you can do this guy can do anything he wants, that he'll have the pick of any college that he chooses to go to from here. And he ends up playing at San Jose State, which actually had a lineage of welcoming Japanese American players and a lot of Asian American athletes, actually, especially for the time. So I think, obviously they wanted him to play there, but there was also a certain familiarity that came with going to a team that had formerly had Japanese American players. And while he's there, he becomes Associated Press All West Coast honorable mention. So he doesn't just go and play, like he's really good and leads his team to the Raisin Bowl, which is I believe like a Tire Bowl now.
Yeah, all these things, they change so much. It's like
we
know it today as the Belk Bowl.
I was about to say the Belk Bowl. It's like a third tier department store.
Yeah, respect to Belk. That's second tier to me.
I think we have time for one more. Quickly, we are not going to address whether Belichick would steal this. I'm sorry, we're not doing any Patriots here now. They don't even make the playoffs anymore.
We are in every way on to Cincinnati.
Do you feel a higher sense of responsibility to tell this history faithfully, given it's undertaught? I guess it would be. Did you feel a sense responsibility since it's undertaught, especially being an outsider to the culture and heritage? That's a very good question. Thank you, Kevin. Did he?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that I thought about and I've thought about every day since I've gotten my book deal. It's one of those things where I worked really hard to not screw this up. And I think that like, I knew that every day that this wasn't my story. And I knew every day that these families, because it was only able to interview one living player. So I knew that all these families that had sort of welcomed me into their lives and welcomed me into their dad's lives or their brother's lives or their uncle's lives had given me this responsibility to tell these stories faithfully. But I also knew that meant not necessarily just telling the stories of these people, but telling the story of the Heart Mountain community, the Japanese American community, and sort of the Japanese community around the world in a certain way as this immigrant story. So I felt a lot of responsibility on that, but maybe I screwed up something that no one has called me on yet. And I'm still waiting for that email or that tweet that says I screwed something up really badly. But I think I felt more of a responsibility to that community than I did to telling a story that other people hadn't told in the past, if that makes sense.
And have you heard, we had a few, I'm going to assume, if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. It looked like we had a few Japanese surnames in the attendees. Have you heard from the Japanese American community? That's a writ large question, but have you heard?
Right. Yeah. And it's, the response has been great. Like I've spoken to a couple different Japanese American groups across the country about the book and about the story. So Japanese American Citizen League groups and Day of Remembrance events. And the response has been warm and welcoming. And every time I get an email or a message that talks about how well I pulled it off, it, sort of relaxes my shoulders a little bit more from that like stress of every day thinking about the responsibility, not the responsibility, but just not wanting to screw it up. And I know that there's a more eloquent way to put that, but like every day I would just like write and be like, don't screw this up. Don't screw this up. And it just came down to like, reading everything you possibly can, talking to as many people as you possibly can, watching things, going through firsthand documents, and just till you get to the point where you're confident enough that you just have all this stuff in your brain and you don't have to constantly be like looking at books and fumbling over things. You can just like write sentences because you know the information. So,
well, we've come to the end. This book is really good. No, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's once again, and like Dave said at the beginning, there's actually, my wife said, oh, that sounds like something I want to read, but I need to read a history of the internment camp, concentration camp, incarceration camp. I'll get it first. And I said, no, actually, that's the first third of the book. You don't need another book.
Yeah, it's there.
It's really good. And the football stuff is actually great. So I encourage that. Second announcement, our next book, it looks like this. Looks like, look, stained glass windows. Miracles on the Hardwood, the hope and prayer story of winning tradition in Catholic college basketball, which is 318.
Catholic,
that would be,
you say right? Catholic college basketball?
Yes. It's, oh, there you go.
I wonder if Patrick's going to want to talk about Marquette.
It's literally going to be 1 hour of me asking a McGuire story and what the hell's wrong with Wojo. But look, I want to point out, Adam Morrison made the cover. If you,
I was at St. Joe's when we beat Adam Morrison's Gonzaga team. So,
and it's by
tying it all in.
You made him cry.
John Gathaway, who you know from ESPN basketball and Prospectus. Lastly, I want to say, so this is now the 4th time I've done this. It's a lot in a year, but I did it twice for my dad, and I need to do it once for my mom. She's here. And she died of COVID last month, as I told you last show. And we are wearing our masks, which you probably should, so more people don't die of COVID. And there's Lenny Harris, her favorite Billings Mustang of all time.
Lenny Harris.
Yes, she football, she tolerated. She went to all my games. It's the only sport I played. She was more of a baseball, basketball fan from Philadelphia, but she was a pediatric nurse, and then she went back and became a Head Start teacher. She very much rooted for the underdog, and the reason Lenny was her favorite Mustang of all time was because our seats were on the third baseline, and he couldn't field a lick, and he could hit, and she just felt bad for him every error. Anyway, she was a wonderful woman, and she took me to Cody when I was a kid. It's the first place I ever had smiley face pancakes. With, you put the fried eggs on the
I know the diner.
nose, the bacon. Yep.
Is it called the iron skillet?
Yes.
Something like that.
It's very close to that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention her. I'm glad that this book coincided with this. We probably could have worked in the Catholic basketball too, but I was glad it coincided with this because she always rooted for the underdog. She gave money even when she had none for most of the last 20 years of her life to the St. La Brea Indian School. If anyone feels like donating a little bit in her name, it's LABRE, St. La Brea Indian School. There are 2 of them. And she would have loved this football team. She definitely would have loved the Eagles, both EAGLES, as she's from Philly, but also that team. And I wanted to give her a shout out. And 500,000, that's fucking insane. But tonight, my mom would have enjoyed this. And, keep wearing the mask. Get the spike. If you need to ham up like me, do it.
Get that BMI up.
Get that BMI up.
That's the one. If there's one message we want people to take away from this, eat up.
Hey, my wife is working in the city and she's taking the subway and she's getting hers next week. So being healthy has long been overrated.
My wife gets her second shot next week too. So.
Oh yeah.
There you go.
Shout out to everybody getting vaccinated. Also, Brad, you wrote a really good book. Everybody should buy it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
All right, Jess. Take us out, please.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Can't hear you.
Oh, I never do that. I forgot to go off mute. You guys were having so much fun.
It was all the ham.
It was all the ham. The ham was killing me. I can't. Now I'm really hungry for ham. I dropped a bunch of links in the chat. So buy the book. Join us again for Squawkin Sports next month. Donate to St. La Brea. Sorry, I probably said it wrong, but thank you guys all so much. This was a really fun conversation. Have a great night, and congrats again, Bradford, on an amazing book. All right,
Thanks,
guys.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody. Good night.
Wyoming sucks.